How the U.S. President Van Buren and Justice Stephen Douglas were responsible for financing and protecting the Joseph Smith Mormon movement to Illinois. Have you ever wondered in your wildest imagination how Joseph Smith supposedly escaped Missouri custody and Liberty Jail for treason and execution, and then just happened to have some horses to travel from Missouri to Illinois, where there was a proposed established homeland, which was to be called Nauvoo, based on a land grant by the state of Illinois? Well, it goes without saying that without some U.S. government backing and protection, the Mormon movement would have died on the vine in Missouri, would have been scattered and destroyed following the extermination order by Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs, but for the acts of the state of Illinois, Justice and U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas and his political mentor and ally, President Van Buren, in providing safe haven for Joseph Smith and all of his Mormon followers. Where Joseph Smith, after being thrown out of Missouri and having Mormon land confiscated in the hundreds and thousands of dollars, sought redress from the U.S. President Van Buren and requested some protection from the Missouri violence. Well, if you recall, Van Buren was reported to have said that, "While your cause is just, I cannot do anything for the Mormons." That was the quote. I guess with some historians state it differently, but it also added that if I help the Mormons, I will lose the state of Missouri, which meant he would lose the Missouri support in the next election. Well, based on circumstances and the actions coming out of Washington and coming out of the state of Illinois, it does appear that Van Buren more than likely was telling a little white lie, because the facts show that most certainly, in secret, Van Buren approval and the management of his political ally, Stephen A. Douglas, Joseph Smith Mormons were granted refuge in the state of Illinois and then provided a safe haven, a homeland, a Mormon homeland, a state within a state of the territory of Illinois, to hopefully provide safety from mob violence and pro-slavery advocates, known as the Border Ruffians, that were marauding, killing, and destroying new immigrants who were attempting to move into these Western territories. Yes, without U.S. funding of the Mormon movement through its land grant process, and without protection of its leader, Joseph Smith, by Stephen A. Douglas, over and over and over again, Stephen Douglas intervened and assisted Joseph Smith in protecting him from being extradited to the violent state of Missouri. So even though there is no documentary evidence showing that this was President Van Buren's decision after he met with Joseph Smith, certainly the circumstances must lead one to believe, including land grants and appointing Stephen Douglas over the Illinois Land Grant Office, that Van Buren, without stating it or publicizing it, secretly assisted the Joseph Smith Mormons in establishing their safe haven and Mormon homeland in Nauvoo. And I'm going to give you several other instances and facts that support this over and over again. Stephen A. Douglas, Justice of the a U.S. Senator, a famous candidate for president, well-respected political figure with a lot of leadership and a lot of serious political strength, personally protected Joseph Smith, became one of his great friends and confidants. And without Stephen A. Douglas, Joseph Smith and the Mormon movement would never have been established in the state of Illinois, out of which that Mormon splinter group called the Brighamites went to Utah and then turned its guns against the United States government. Stephen Douglas and Joseph Smith knew very well that the Quorum of the 12 were his enemies. How many times did the Quorum of the 12 testify against Smith, starting in Missouri? Okay, starting in Missouri, they totally, Orson Pratt testified that Joseph Smith was a traitor to the U.S., was trying to overthrow the U.S. government, and wanted to establish a kingdom of God. While all along, the U.S. government knew that Joseph Smith was working on its behalf and moving immigrants and voters into the western states to vote out slavery and provide immigrants and citizens to the various states in its manifest destiny policy to move the United States clear to the Pacific Ocean and throw off the continual invasions of the British government. It goes on and on and on. But Joseph Smith definitely had some powerful friends in Congress and the United States government, and Stephen A. Douglas should be given more credit by the Brighamite Utah Mormons for the fact that without Stephen A. Douglas, there would be no Mormons in Utah. Because without Stephen A. Douglas and President Martin Van Buren, Nauvoo would have never been established in Illinois, and all Mormons would have been scattered and destroyed after the Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs' extermination order. So while President Martin Van Buren supposedly told Joseph Smith he could do nothing for him, President Martin Van Buren, in fact, in secret, organized and assisted the Mormons to move to the state of Illinois through the help and assistance and management of his political ally and supporter, Stephen A. Douglas. Both Stephen A. Douglas and Martin Van Buren were Jacksonian Democrats, just like Joseph Smith told Josiah Quincy and Charles Adams 4 weeks before his death. Joseph Smith stated, "I am a Jacksonian Democrat. I believe in outlawing slavery, just like Charles Adams and Josiah Quincy, and in secret, Stephen A. Douglas, who publicly towed the line between trying to keep the Union together and secretly abolishing slavery in each state. And President Van Buren and Stephen A. Douglas and many other political figures used the Mormon movement to effectuate their political policy of outlawing slavery and expanding the U.S. into the western states to the Pacific in order to overthrow permanently the constant invasions of the British banking oligarchs. So why don't we hear any of this information today from the Utah Brighamite Mormons? Well, because Brigham Young and his band of 12 traitors called the Quorum of the 12 and his blood atonement assassins, called the Danite Avenging Angels, were working against the United States and for the British government, hoping to promote slavery and break off of the United States and become a loyal British colony. The minute that Brigham Young was given safe haven, safe passage out of the United States, Brigham Young turned around and declared war on the United States, installed slavery into the state of Utah, and backed the Confederates in the Civil War. He was a dastardly being, and the fact that the Utah Mormons still try and promote Brigham Young as some kind of hero shows the character flaws still evident in the present Mormon establishment in Utah. So this is a part 1 of my investigation of how Stephen A. Douglas and President Martin Van Buren protected, financed, and supported the Joseph Smith, Illinois Nauvoo Mormon movement. And throughout my investigation, I'm going to be showing you that direct and circumstantial evidence points to the fact that without Stephen A. Douglas and Martin Van Buren, the Mormon movement would have been destroyed in Missouri and would have not seen the light of day in the Utah territories. For Brigham Young to invent a whole new Mormon movement that created slavery, that created polygamy and enslaved women, and declared war on the United States for which Joseph Smith was an agent and was financed and supported in order to expand the nation and protect it against the British oligarchs and the British bankers who, by the way, financed Brigham Young and gave him the plan to attack the United States in preparation for the Civil War. So let's go through some of the points that are obvious or not so obvious. First, Stephen Douglas, with the help of President Martin Van Buren, orchestrated Smith's release from Missouri Liberty Jail through the secret negotiations with Judge Birch, who set Smith free by instructing the sheriffs transferring Joseph Smith between jails to set Joseph Smith and his company free. Judge Birch refused to sign and date the writ of mittimus, which technically set Joseph Smith free the minute he stepped out of Liberty Jail. 2. Stephen A. Douglas was primarily responsible for negotiating with the Illinois legislature to pass the laws protecting Nauvoo and allowing it to be a state within a state to protect itself by organizing a militia and defending against the pro-slavery mobsters who were killing systematically anybody and any leader who attempted to vote the anti-slavery bill in any of these border states, including Missouri, Illinois, and other states. And we all remember Bleeding Kansas, where blood ran in the streets from pro-slavery and anti-slavery fighters fighting each other. Also, Stephen A. Douglas opened up his home city of Quincy, Illinois, to welcome the fleeing Mormons from Illinois. Quincy, Illinois provided these Mormons who were starving food, home, and shelter. What other city would have done that without the leadership and influence of someone as influential as Stephen A. Douglas, Justice of the Supreme Court, Senator, agent of the land office, etc. He was a leader that was respected and considered one of our great United States heroes. Stephen A. Douglas assured that Joseph Smith would be provided with legal defense and safety. For example, in the first Missouri extradition order against Joseph Smith, Stephen A. Douglas was the judge who dismissed the extradition order in 1841. Secondly, Stephen A. Douglas, appointed by President Van Buren from Washington to head the land office in Illinois so that Illinois could provide the territory of commerce and Nauvoo to protect and provide a safe haven and a territory, a state within a state and a territory of Nauvoo. Then, through his political influence, Stephen A. Douglas assured the safety again when Joseph Smith's second extradition trial in 1843 for the writ extraditing him on the attempted assassination of Little Burn Boggs. Stephen A. Douglas provided a fair through his political influence assured that Joseph Smith would get a fair trial in Springville, in which his colleague in the Illinois legislature, Abraham Lincoln sent his wife as a personal court watcher. Mary Todd Lincoln watched the proceedings in front of Judge Pope in 1843 in Springfield, in which Judge Pope again released Joseph Smith from the writ of extradition into the violent state of Missouri, where his execution would be assured. Judge Pope, Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, Stephen A. Douglas were those responsible for saving Joseph Smith once again from certain death. Then again, Joseph Smith, arrested in Dixon, Illinois, on a third warrant, was given the support of a very influential political attorney called Cyrus White. Now, who else can boast of such high political friends and supporters such as Stephen A. Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, Josiah Quincy, and Charles Adams, probably the highest political influential Washingtonian in the group, higher than Abraham Lincoln in political influence and bloodline families. Also, Jacksonian Democrat Joseph Smith was supported by Andrew Jackson. Joseph Smith was appointed as an Indian agent, U.S. Indian agent, to negotiate the treaty with Chief Keokuk under the Indian Removal Act, and successfully acted on behalf of the United States in establishing the entire state of Illinois free from the paid mercenary tribes of Keokuk. So with some of these issues, I am going to investigate further and in later videos and show you that despite the fact that it is written that President Martin Van Buren told Joseph Smith that he could do nothing for the Mormons, quite the contrary, President Van Buren, Jacksonian Democrat, and mentor and political ally of Stephen A. Douglas, actually orchestrated and established Illinois, Nauvoo, as a safe homeland for the Mormons.